All right, hi ladies. So here is a continuation of our lecture from class. Third period we discussed religious beliefs. Fourth period we didn't. So if you're in third period, you can skip ahead to the next slide. Fourth period, we discussed how religious beliefs are the second most important predictor of vote choice after party ID. And I think this is common sense, right? You guys kind of already knew this, that there are certain issues that are really, really important to certain segments of the population, specifically to different religious groups. I know you could name a couple things like abortion are one of the major ones, the death penalty is another big one, and also immigration is a kind of an extension of religion, and then social services are another big one. We talked a little bit also about how if you go to church or if you go to worship every week, that you are kind of self-selecting a group of your peers that have a common set of values. And really importantly, you are also getting together with a leader who is kind of helping you guys come up with a coherent message. So, for example, if you go to a church, you have that gospel, or you have somebody standing up and sharing their beliefs and telling you kind of what is moral and what is not. And that can help influence political decisions. You also need to know that 82% of voters consider religion to be an important part of their lives. Interestingly, religion used to be focused on the left. It used to be a liberal thing. And so if you thought of kind of the more religious people, they tended to vote liberally. That's kind of not the case today. I think the case today, you would expect the other side. Now I think of religious groups, and I think of them as being more conservative. If you think of religion being focused on the left, think about Reverend MLK Jr., Reverend Al Sharpton, Reverend Jesse Jackson, who are both significant members of the Black community, but also of the religious community. Then in 1972, when Nixon was running for president, he advocated for a return to a silent majority. And what he meant by the silent majority was the silent majority was the majority of people who had Christian values, and he relied on them to be elected. And this signified a shift to the religion being focused on the right. Today, you think of people like Reverend Pat Robinson, who's focused on the right, that photo on the right at the bottom of the screen. And he is what you call an evangelical Christian. Evangelicals have a huge amount of political power today. In fact, they have formed something called the Christian Coalition, which distributes voter guides evaluating candidates on a range of issues important to conservative evangelical churches. So it's really a coherent message. So if you can persuade the evangelical right, they have such significant political clout today that they can constitute a large majority. Today, you'll notice in the political campaigns today, you'll notice some of the candidates, specifically the Republican candidates, really kind of targeting the evangelical right by discussing their religion, by positioning themselves on certain issues that are really important to evangelical Christians, and by going to church and using certain language in their speeches. I find this chart really fascinating. It is an age distribution by religious group. So it's really fascinating for you to look at. If you look down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see darkest is 18 to 29, middle is 30 to 49, 50 to 64, and 65 plus is over here. So you'll notice that there are kind of smaller percentages. Most of the religions, except for Muslims and Hindus, and actually unaffiliated, most of the religions have a smaller percentage of young people. And then they tend to have a larger percentage of middle-aged people. And then again, a smaller percentage of elderly. And so I would argue that the largest percentage of religious people is between the ages of 30 and 64, right? Or 30 and 49, but then you could extend that and say 30 and 64. That would make up the largest percentages. It's interesting if you break this out by religion. If you look at the evangelicals have a large number of middle-aged people. Catholics have a large number of middle-aged people. Again, smaller numbers of young people. Jews are roughly equal, so you've got about a quarter in each age group. The Mormons have a huge percentage of middle-aged people, which is interesting. And Orthodox Christians have just about a 40%, which is really big. So I thought this was really fascinating. You can think about kind of who you know and really look at this data and figure out who is the most religious in our society, which age group is the most religious. And I would say it's the middle-aged people between 30 and 49. And if you were to say that, clarify what you mean by middle-aged. So other people would say middle-aged isn't really until 50 to 64. Okay, so you kind of already knew some of these trends, but this is just an idea for you to think about. What are some other trends that you know about around religion? This was also fascinating. This is ideology among U.S. religious groups, and it's a study done from 2009 by Gallup, who does a lot of our polling here in America. And you'll notice that the dark is conservatives, the medium is moderates, and the light green is the percent of liberals. So you'll see that Protestants, Catholics, and Mormons have low percentage of liberals, but a high percentage of conservatives. And so that kind of, you could claim that maybe the Christian right tends to vote conservative. I think you could make a generalization based on the data that the Christian right has higher percentages of conservatives than liberals, and even than moderates. Interestingly, though, if you look at the data, the conservatives is high, but then moderates is not too far behind. Whereas compare the conservatives to the liberals, and you'll see a big difference. Then you move over to the Jews, Muslims, and the a-religious or non-religious, and you'll notice that they tend to be more liberal, consistently more liberal, except for Muslims who tend to be a bit more moderate. But everybody else seems to be a bit more liberal or moderate. And this is really, I think, fascinating data that really backs up the statement that many conservatives tend to be more religious and Christian. You also might want to note that if somebody is a-religious, they're not going to church every week, and so they're not getting together with a group of peers of like-minded individuals around morals and values. And so you could say that they're maybe thinking more individually. Okay, so here's a next question, moving into race and ethnicity. Go ahead and pose a little answer in your notes if you can. Why is race and ethnicity a reliable predictor of people's political beliefs? And why do minority groups tend to be more liberal? We discussed a little bit of this in class. So this is important. Minority groups tend to be more liberal because they tend to be less wealthy, often because of systematic racism in our society, and less access to higher education, language barriers, etc. And so because they tend to be less wealthy, they tend to be more dependent on government resources. Therefore, they want more government involvement, and more government involvement, or a belief in having big government, is an inherently liberal concept. Did everybody follow that? Therefore, because racial minorities tend to want more government involvement, because they want to benefit from those social welfare, then they tend to vote liberally, right? Whereas Republicans and conservatives tend to want less big government, and therefore less social services for minorities. Sorry, this is a little bit fuzzy, but this shows the demographics of Romney and Obama voters. This is back from 2002. You'll notice that Romney had significantly more white voters, at 83% white voters, whereas Obama had only 56% of white voters. Then Obama had a huge percentage of black voters compared to Romney. You got 24.5% versus 2%. And Latinos came out in large numbers for Obama, which is really, as we heard about in that radio excerpt, a little bit more unusual. Latinos are not a group that tend to have high efficacy. They tend not to come out to vote as frequently or consistently as other minority groups. And then you'll see, too, that Obama won a larger percentage of the Asian vote at 4% as compared to Romney's 2%. Other is 2% and 2% for both of them. So I thought that was fascinating. It'll be really interesting to see where different groups fall for this upcoming election, for the 2016 election. Gender is also a large indicator of how different people will vote. Unmarried women, so for tax purposes, we'll call unmarried women, we'll call them single, or unmarried, anybody you call single. Even if you're in a relationship, you still call them single. So single women tend to be Democrats. They tend to have more liberal attitudes about social welfare. Women in general have more liberal attitudes about social welfare, things like education, juvenile justice, capital punishment, the environment, etc. And they tend to have a negative view about war and military intervention. Married white men tend to be the core of the Republican Party. They tend to have more conservative values. Marriage is, interestingly, an indicator. As you get married, often your political beliefs tend to blend. So you adopt the political beliefs of your partner often. You'll see that the Republican Party in general, though, tends to rely upon married white men. Age is also an important indicator of voter preference. You'll see that different age groups have different interests. It makes sense, right? What's important for you guys as young future college students might be things like college tuition or college loan rates, federal loan rates. Those might be what's really important to you. But those might not be so important to somebody who is maybe a grandparent, right? Who's 60 or 70 and they're retired. They're not going to care most about student loan rates. They might care more about Medicare. And this leads to an important point, that people tend to vote what is best for them, right? So people vote where their self-interest is and where their self-interest lies. But they have to be educated and aware about what those self-interests are. So that's an important distinction for you guys to know. And I have the example here. Retiring baby boomers concerned with Social Security and Medicare don't want limitations on Medicare, and they don't really want to pay for school taxes pay for schools through tax increases, whereas young people would want to resist higher taxes to pay for Medicare and would much rather have those go towards things like schools. Region is the last big indicator. The South tends to want stronger states and a weaker federal government, kind of like who? The Federalists. And then you'll see they tend to be more religious. 2/3 of the South is Protestant and 45% for the rest of the nation. So that's really important. So 2/3, 66% of the South is Protestant, whereas compared to 45% for the rest of the nation. So religion plays a role regionally. Church attendance is also highest in the South. So 46% of people go to church weekly in the South versus 34% going to church or synagogue in the Northeast. So you'll see that's a big difference. So religiosity tends to be stronger in the South. And then the West is really interesting. It tends to be anti-government. California is kind of an anomaly in the sense that we tend to vote here in California, it tends to vote Democrat. It tends to be a blue state. But the West as a whole tends to be a little bit red. So if you think about Utah, Nevada, Arizona, all of those states tend to be red states. And then you have the coastal states. The coasts are different. You'll see in this map here that the coasts tend to vote blue. So you'll see the areas like Seattle, Portland, the whole California coast tends to vote blue. And if you move over to the East Coast, you'll see the northern states tend to vote blue. Further south, you have the liberal enclaves of Chicago around the Great Lakes, and a little bit of Minnesota. Moving south, you'll see, look at Texas. Texas is very red, with a little bit of blue in there, which is unusual. So this is kind of interesting for you to look at. This was the 2012 Obama versus Romney results. So you'll see the central core of the country tends to be red. Another thing you should notice is urban versus rural. Rural areas tend to vote conservative. Cities tend to vote liberal. Big cities tend to vote more liberal. Why would that be? Think about that for a second. What is the demographic population of big cities? The demographic population of big cities tends to be a lot of minorities, right? And again, we already reviewed why minorities tend to vote liberal. Okay, so quick check for understanding. See if you can make sure you can answer these questions. Okay, moving on to public opinion and polling. So public opinion. Public opinion is what the public thinks about a particular issue or set of issues at any one point in time. Then you have public opinion polls. Public opinion polls are interviews or surveys with samples of citizens that are used to estimate the feelings and beliefs of the entire population. Your homework was to take a YouGov public opinion poll. What were your responses? Hopefully you took the one about politics. If you didn't, click this link here and please go back and take the one about politics. It's a very short public opinion survey, but I thought it was interesting and it was kind of the easiest and quickest one for you to get a sense of what it is. I want you to pay attention to how the questions and how the options are worded. In the political affinity test that we took in class, some of you guys noticed that you didn't have an I don't know option. That is okay, and that was on purpose. So thinking about how the questions are worded, what are they included, and what are they not including for you guys to take as an option. That's all important for you to pay attention to. And I'm sure you've learned about this in your math classes and some of you for your psych classes as well. Okay, 2 big questions. Should the government rely upon public opinion polling to impact policy decisions? AKA, should the government do what the majority of the public says to do in polls? So for example, if you took a poll asking if people were for or against a war, and most people said for the war, should you then go to the war? Or vice versa, if they were against the war, would you then not go to war? Or are polls even a good indicator of the majority, or are they just good indicators of subgroups with strong opinions? And that's important because you think about who actually responds to those public opinion polls. And we'll talk about that when we talk about problems, but often somebody who's kind of apathetic, if they're asked if they want to take a poll, they're going to say, no, I'm okay, I don't really care either way, right? Whereas somebody who has a really strong opinion and wants to make their voice heard, they're much more likely to take the survey in the first place. And the term for, somebody who thinks about that government must allow for the expression of minority opinions and that democracy works best when those different voices are allowed to fight it out in the public arena is pluralist. Sorry for that. Okay, types of polls and problems with polls. Straw polls. Straw polls are unscientific and unreliable polls. It's mostly what you need to know. Push polls. They provide information on an opponent that would lead respondents to vote against that candidate. They push voters away from another candidate. So these are those kind of really biased questions where you say, would you still vote for this person if you knew that they cheated on their wife, for example? Or would you still do this if you knew? Well, and they're designed to push voters away from another candidate. You have tracking polls. Tracking polls are continuous surveys that enable a campaign to chart its daily rise or fall in support. So often people sign up, they say, yes, I'm willing to take this every day at the same time, and you answer just a quick yes or no question or a multiple choice question. Then you have exit polls. Exit polls and tracking polls are probably the most common today. Exit polls are taken as voters leave on election day. They're simply asked, who did you vote for? You'll see that a lot of news networks, especially on election day or election night, they will track exit polls. Big considerations you need to keep in mind are the sample size, timing, wording, motivation, keeping in mind only highly motivated people respond, and also landlines versus cell phones. I don't know about you guys, but I don't have a landline anymore. I only have my cell phone. And the lists that people use for these polls are often landlines. Cell phones have different regulations and rules around who can call. So, and I don't answer phone calls from numbers I don't recognize. So I'm much less likely to pick up a phone call for a survey than maybe somebody who has a landline who maybe doesn't have something like caller ID. Random samples versus stratified samples so a random sample is census data that's just used to divide the country into 4 sampling regions. That's a stratified sample. Random samples are just random samples. They pick a number, they call it, they ask you. Stratified samples are different. Stratified samples, they take census data, they divide the country into 4 sampling regions. So say you have Northeast, Southeast, Northwest, Southwest. Then they break them up into statistical areas that randomly selected in proportion to the national population. So for example, if you have, say 20% of the national population is African American, then you pick 20% of your region people who are African American to then poll, if that makes sense. Okay, there's some big problems with polling though. Are they reliable? That's a big question. What's the margin of error? Sampling error, right? There could be problems with the questions. There could be problems with who answers the questions. There are limited respondent options. That was one big thing that you guys ran into in your political affinity quiz, that you guys were upset that there wasn't an I don't know option. A lack of information. A lot of people aren't educated or just don't care about the issue, and so then they say some stuff like I don't care or I don't know, but that type of information is not always helpful. Okay, so I put a poll up here. Please try to tell me what type of poll this is and what information it tells you. Okay, so if you look down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see that this is an exit poll data from 2012 election between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. This is voter demographic information for 18 to 29-year-olds, so young people, and it's looking at how the demographic breakdown of young people voted. So you see young Hispanic females, young Hispanic males, young black females, young black males, young white females, young white males. And then you see all young people. So all young people voted about 60% for Barack Obama, and then a smaller percentage for Mitt Romney. And you'll see Mitt Romney had the most traction with young white males, and then followed closely by young white females and young Hispanic males. And then falling down to black males. He had the least traction with black females, young black females, which is interesting, and with young Hispanic females. If you look at Barack Obama, he had the opposite. He had the most traction with young black females, followed closely by young Hispanic females and young black males, and then young Hispanic males, then white females, and then least with young white males. So I thought this was a really interesting poll data. Okay, so big things you need to know are why we form and express political opinions. The biggest thing is personal benefits, right? How can this affect me? Um, Going back to that example about age, right? People are going to vote for things that really impact them. Political knowledge, being part of a democracy depends on having an educated population or an educated populace. What's interesting and what's kind of tough is that the people who pay attention tend to and people who pay attention and who participate tend to dictate political opinion and public opinion. So people who don't really know, or maybe who don't follow, or people who don't care, just follow the crowd. And so they follow how their friends vote or how their community votes. Um, Often we take cues from leaders or opinion makers. We kind of just follow the leader's ideas. If somebody's telling us to vote a certain way, then we vote that way. Thinking back to religion and the examples we talked about with religion and being able to go to church frequently. The bully pulpit, the president has something called the bully pulpit. He's the leader of our country, and so he has kind of proportionate media coverage of his views and pushing people one way or another, including other politicians. We'll talk about that when we talk about the executive. And then the media, right? The media helps to shape the political dialogue and shape what is being talked about when. You also have political ideology. A lot of people vote the party line. I'm a Republican, so I vote Republican. Or I'm a liberal, so I vote liberal. Conservatives often want smaller, less activist government, limited social welfare, and reduced government, regulation of businesses. They have very strong views on social issues like abortion and same-sex marriage. Whereas liberals tend to want a more active role of the federal government, and the government plays an important role in helping with social issues, helping those who need it. So think about the impact of polls. Examples would be the Iowa caucus. There's a bandwagon effect where people saw how the candidates did in the Iowa caucus, and so they tended to say, okay, we've narrowed the pool down to Cruz, the Republican pool, down to Cruz, Rubio, and Trump. Those are the top three. And so a lot of people tend to shift their votes after seeing that initial kind of test to see where Iowa is. Same thing for the Democratic caucus. So in the Iowa caucus, it helps to define the conversation. For example, Huckabee dropped out after Iowa after he saw that he only had a very small percentage of the votes. All right, so now it's your turn. Please try to categorize that voter. So first one is a late 20s single Seattle atheist. Then you have a white, middle-aged, high school education, married, male farmer from Iowa. Then you have a Florida retiree on Medicaid. Single mother, middle-aged, Hispanic in Arizona. New Yorker in early 30s, college-educated, female, African American. And some of these are tricky. It's okay to say you don't know because they might vote differently in different places. All right, so the late 20s single Seattle atheist would most likely vote Democrat. She is a-religious, so they tend to vote a little bit more liberally. She's on a coastal city in Seattle, and she's a young female, right? A young female. Then moving down to white, middle-aged, high school education, married, male farmer from Iowa. He's most likely to be a strong conservative. He's in a rural area. Rural groups tend to vote more conservatively. High school education, remember college has a liberalizing effect, so the less education, the more likely to be conservative. Middle-aged tends to vote slightly more conservative, and he's white and married. Okay, Florida retiree on Medicaid. This one's a little tricky. Florida tends to go conservative. The elderly tend to vote a little bit more conservatively, but Medicaid is also a government benefit. So that one's a little tricky. I would say that they were maybe fiscally conservative, but socially liberal. It's a little bit tricky, but again, it's a tough one. Single mother, middle-aged, Hispanic in Arizona. Even though Arizona tends to be a red state, you have a minority population, middle-aged, female, who's a single mom, potentially benefiting from government services, both as a single mother and as a Hispanic minority group. So I would say that she would be a liberal. New Yorker, early 30s, college-educated, female, African-American, would also probably go liberal. Coastal city, early 30s, college-educated. She's female and an African-American, so a minority, and so therefore more liberal. Okay, so quick check for understanding. Why do U.S. citizens hold certain beliefs about politics? How do families, schools, and media perpetuate or change these beliefs? How does political culture affect and inform political participation? So these are the same list of essential questions from the beginning of the lecture that we covered in class. So please make sure that you can answer these questions. If you do not feel you can answer these questions, please come see me and ask for help. I'm available during collaboration, and we should talk. This is an example of a short response question that I also want you to be able to do. So the figure below displays voting patterns by state in the 1982 and 1996 presidential elections. Using the information in the figure and your knowledge of United States voting behavior, perform the following tasks. Identify one of the numbered regions with strong support for the Democratic presidential candidate, and identify and explain 2 factors that contribute to that support. Using the map below, identify one of the numbered regions with strong support for the Republican presidential candidate, and identify and explain 2 factors that contribute to this support. So a big thing you want to do here is count the verbs, right? So it's asking you to identify one of the numbered regions, so that's 1. Then it's asking you with strong Democratic support. Then it's asking you to identify and explain 2 factors that contribute to that support. So how many verbs is that? If we say identify and explain for 2, let's call that 4 verbs, right? Because you're going to identify and explain, identify and explain. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you're also going to identify one of the numbered regions with strong support. Okay, so that means part A is worth 5 points. Moving down, part B. Using the map below, identify one of the numbered regions with strong support for the Republican presidential candidate. And identify and explain, identify and explain. Part B is also worth 5 points. Okay, so this question as a whole is worth 10 points. So you need to make sure that you have identified, then identified and explained 1 factor, and identified and explained 1 factor for the Democrat. Then below, identify 1 region, then identify, explain, identify, explain. Here's the map. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to go ahead and do this on your own. The answer rubric is posted here in slides that are available on Schoology. So please make sure that you do this question as a practice. You can flip back and forth, come up with your answer, make sure that it's a good answer. This is your chance. Again, the more practice you get with these short responses, the better you're going to do on the AP exam. So practice this. The answer is available here. And I'm not going to click it because I want you to do it first. Okay? Make sure you can answer these essential questions. Let me know if you're having any trouble. And I'm looking forward to seeing you all in class.